My family mocked me for inheriting a rusted bicycle until they found out it held a secret worth more than their entire estate. The funeral was over by noon, but the real show started around 3 in the afternoon when my father and brother finally showed up at Grandpa's house. I was already in the garage, just standing there like an idiot, breathing in that familiar smell of motor oil and old wood that had been my childhood. The kind of smell that sticks to your clothes for days and makes you feel like you're 7 years old again, watching Grandpa restore some rusty piece of junk into something beautiful. My father, Robert, walked in first, and I swear the man looked like he was attending a board meeting instead of sorting through his dead father's belongings. Expensive charcoal suit, probably cost more than my truck. Polished shoes that had no business being within 50 feet of a garage floor covered in decades of oil stains and metal shavings. My brother Kyle followed right behind him, wearing almost the exact same outfit, like they coordinated their costumes for this performance. The whole thing felt wrong, disrespectful. Somehow, they didn't even look at me at first. Just started talking between themselves about the property value, about how much the house would fetch on the market, about whether they should hire a real estate agent or go with a direct buyer. Numbers. Always numbers with these two. I wanted to tell them that Grandpa had been in the ground for less than 3 hours, but I knew it would be pointless. Instead, I just stood there next to this old bicycle that was buried under a mountain of paint cans and shop rags, remembering something Grandpa told me when I was maybe 12 years old. He'd been working on a transmission that day, hands black with grease, and he looked up at me with those sharp blue eyes that never seemed to age even when the rest of him did. People are like bearings, Mark. He'd said, if you don't grease them with love, they start to squeak, and then they fall apart completely. I didn't understand it back then. Thought it was just another one of his weird garage philosophies. But standing there watching my father and brother treat his life space like a foreclosed storage unit, I finally got it. They'd been squeaking for years. Decades, maybe. And now they'd fallen apart so completely that they couldn't even pretend to care for one afternoon. My father finally acknowledged my existence by pointing at the workbench. His face had this expression I'd seen 1,000 times growing up, disgust mixed with irritation, like he'd just stepped in something unpleasant. He started talking about the garage being a disaster, a liability, an environmental nightmare waiting to happen. Gesture at the shelves lined with old paint cans, containers of solvents, mason jars filled with God knows what kind of chemicals. Some of those jars didn't even have labels anymore, just cryptic notes in Grandpa's handwriting that made sense only to him. My father kept using words like hazardous waste disposal and EPA violations and potential fines. His lawyer voice, the one he used when he wanted to make you feel stupid for not seeing what was so obvious to him. Kyle chimed in with numbers, because of course he did. Talked about how a proper hazmat cleanup service would charge thousands, maybe tens of thousands depending on what was actually in all those containers. Mentioned something about soil contamination testing, and how that alone could run 5 figures. They were building a case, and I was too tired and sad to see where it was going yet. Then my father turned to look at the bicycle. This old Schwinn Black Phantom from 1955, all rust and peeling chrome, half buried under a tarp and surrounded by boxes of old spark plugs. I'd loved that bike when I was a kid. Grandpa used to let me sit on it in the garage. Told me stories about riding bikes like that when he was young, before the world got so complicated. Promised me that one day we'd restore it together. We never did. Life got in the way it always does. My father made this dismissive sound in his throat, called it junk, said the whole garage was filled with worthless junk that would cost a fortune to dispose of properly. And that's when I saw it, that little sparkle in his eye, the same look he got when he found a loophole in a contract or convinced someone to settle out of court for pennies on the dollar. He was about to make a move. He turned to me with this practiced smile, friendly, reasonable, completely fake. He laid out his proposition like he was doing me a favor. Said he knew I had a shop of my own now, a small garage where I did restoration work on old cars and motorcycles. Said he figured I'd have the space and expertise to handle all of Grandpa's stuff. Tools, equipment, supplies, everything. He used the word comprehensive about 6 times, like he was trying to hypnotize me with lawyer speak. Then he threw in the kicker. He'd let me have it all. Free. Every last piece. I just had to haul it away and deal with the disposal myself. I should have seen it coming. Should have recognized the trap. But I was exhausted from the funeral and the grief and the sheer emotional weight of watching the two people who should have cared most about Grandpa treat his memory like an inconvenient mess. And I was looking at that bicycle, thinking about all those promises we'd made each other. I hesitated, told him I didn't know if I had room for all of it. My shop was already pretty full, and I lived in a small rental house with barely any storage. Where was I supposed to put dozens of containers of old chemicals and years' worth of accumulated tools and parts? Kyle jumped in then, playing good cop to my father's bad cop, said I could take my time, rent a storage unit if I needed to. The important thing was getting it out of the house before they put it on the market. They'd already had a buyer express serious interest, but the guy wanted the property clean, move-in ready, no complications. My father watched me stare at the bicycle. He knew. Bastard knew exactly which buttons to push. He said I could keep anything I wanted. The bike, obviously. Any tools I could use. He made it sound generous. Made it sound like he was thinking about what Grandpa would have wanted. And maybe part of me wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that somewhere under that expensive suit was the son Grandpa had raised. The brother I'd looked up to as a kid before law school turned him into this. I said yes. God help me, I said yes. That's when my father pulled out his portable printer from his briefcase. This sleek little thing that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He had his laptop right there too, already open, like he'd been preparing for this exact moment. Started typing up a contract right there in the garage, while I stood there feeling increasingly uneasy about the whole situation. He was fast, scarily fast. His fingers flew across the keyboard, and within minutes he had multiple pages ready to print. The printer hummed and spat out sheets of paper that he caught and arranged with practiced efficiency. He read through the whole thing out loud, using that professional voice lawyers use when they want to make everything sound official and binding and slightly intimidating. Most of it was standard stuff. I agreed to remove all contents of the garage within 30 days. I agreed that all items became my property upon signing. I agreed to indemnify the estate against any claims. That word indemnify should have been my first warning, but I was focused on the bicycle and the memories and trying not to think about how much I miss Grandpa. Then he got to section 4.2. Read it slower, more deliberately, like he wanted to make absolutely sure I heard every word. The recipient accepts full material responsibility for any and all environmental risks and disposal costs associated with any contents of the subject property, known or unknown, including but not limited to hazardous materials, toxic substances, flammable compounds, corrosive agents, and any other materials requiring special handling or disposal under local, state, or federal environmental regulations. He looked up at me, asked if I understood. Use that patient tone people use when they think you're not quite smart enough to grasp what they're saying. I nodded, told him I got it. I'd handle the disposal properly. Take the chemicals to the hazmat collection site. Pay whatever fees they charged. It would be worth it to save the bike and honor Grandpa's memory. Kyle was smirking. I caught him trying to hide it, but I saw it, this little satisfied smile, like they just pulled off something clever. At the time, I thought they were just happy to avoid the disposal costs. Thought they were being cheap and lazy, which honestly was pretty standard for them. My father produced a pen from his jacket pocket, one of those heavy, expensive pens that probably had real gold plating. Clicked it once and held out to me. The contract sat on Grandpa's workbench, right next to an old vise that still had a piece of metal clamped in it from whatever project he'd been working on before he died. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was about to get clamped into something, but I was too stubborn or stupid or grief-stricken to see it. I picked up the pen. It had weight to it. Felt serious. Felt binding. I flipped through the pages one more time, skimming the legal language that all kind of blurred together. My father stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking patient, looking like a man who had all the time in the world because he knew he'd already won. The signature lines were at the bottom of the last page. Multiple copies. One for me, one for him, one for the estate. Professional. Thorough. Everything my father did was thorough. I signed my name 3 times. Mark Sullivan. Same signature I've been using since high school. A quick scrawl that Grandpa used to say looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. My hand was shaking a little. I told myself it was because I'd been standing in the cold garage for too long. Told myself it was exhaustion from the funeral. But somewhere deep in my gut, something was sending up warning signals that I was too overwhelmed to hear. My father took the pen back, signed his own name with this flourish, like he was closing a major business deal, dated each copy, separated them into neat stacks, handed me mine with this smile that I'd seen before, but couldn't quite place in the moment. Later, I'd recognize it. It was the same smile he used to have when he won cases, when he got the judge to rule in his favor, when he convinced a jury that his version of events was the only logical truth. Victory. That's what that smile meant. Pure, undiluted victory. He told me congratulations. Said I was now the proud owner of everything in the garage. Said I had 30 days but could start hauling stuff away whenever I was ready. Told me he'd already had the locks changed on the house, but I could keep the garage key. Pulled off his own keyring right there. This old brass key on a faded leather tab that said property of Harry Sullivan in Grandpa's handwriting. That almost broke me. Seeing Grandpa's handwriting on that little piece of leather, knowing that he'd labeled his own key like he labeled everything else in his life, organized and careful and thorough. My father didn't even pause. Just held out the key like he was handing me a business card. I reached for it. Our hands met for just a second, and I felt this wave of something I couldn't quite name. Not quite anger. Not quite sadness. Something in between. Something that tasted like betrayal and felt like resignation. He pulled his hand back before I could fully grasp the key. Let it drop. It fell through the air and landed in the dirt and oil stains on the garage floor, right near my feet. The leather tab soaked up a puddle of something dark and viscous immediately. The brass caught the late afternoon light, coming through the garage door, throwing off this dull gleam. Neither my father nor Kyle made any move to pick it up. They were already heading for the door, already done with this transaction, already mentally moving on to whatever came next in their efficient, calculated lives. My father was talking to Kyle about dinner reservations, about some restaurant downtown that had a 6-month waiting list unless you knew the right people. They were laughing about something as they walked out into the sunlight. I stood there in the dimness of the garage, staring down at that key in the dirt, staring at my grandfather's handwriting slowly getting soaked through with old motor oil. And I felt this weird combination of relief and anxiety churning in my stomach. Relief because I'd saved something of Grandpa's. Anxiety because something about the way my father had smiled made me feel like I'd just lost a game I hadn't even known I was playing. The sound of their car doors slamming echoed across the property. Expensive German engineering, the kind that closes with the solid thunk that announces money. Their engine started with barely a whisper. They pulled out of the driveway without looking back, without even a wave goodbye. I bent down and picked up the key. The oil made it slippery, made my fingers black. I wiped it on my jeans, tried to clean off the leather tab, but Grandpa's handwriting was already starting to blur. Even his name was getting erased. It felt prophetic. Felt like everything he'd built was being systematically wiped away by people who should have been protecting his memory. I looked around the garage, really looked at it for the first time since they'd cornered me with their contract. Saw the years of accumulated stuff, the shelves packed with mystery chemicals, the corners filled with parts that probably didn't fit anything anymore, the bicycle buried under everything like a treasure waiting to be discovered. And I realized what I just agreed to. Not just the disposal costs, not just the hauling and the sorting and the storage problems. I'd agreed to be the one who dismantled my grandfather's life, to be the one who decided what was worth keeping and what was trash, to be the one who erased his space from the world. My father had made me the executioner, and I'd signed up for the job willingly, eagerly even, all because I wanted to save one rusted bicycle and couldn't see the bigger picture through my grief. The afternoon light was starting to fade. Golden hour, photographers call it. That brief window when everything looks beautiful and nostalgic and temporary. I stood there holding that oil-stained key, feeling the weight of it in my palm, and tried to convince myself that I'd made the right choice. Try to tell myself that Grandpa would understand, would approve, would be happy that at least one person cared enough to preserve something of his. But that smile kept coming back to me. My father's predatory, satisfied smile, and the way Kyle had smirked, and the careful, deliberate way they'd structured that contract. And I knew, somewhere deep down where truth lives before we bury it with rationalizations and hope, that I'd just made a terrible mistake. I just didn't know how terrible yet. The key felt heavier with each passing second, like it was gaining weight, like it was made of something denser than brass. I squeezed it tight enough that the teeth bit into my palm. The pain helped, gave me something to focus on besides a growing dread in my chest, besides a nagging feeling that I'd just been played by someone who'd spent his entire career learning how to manipulate people through legal language and false smiles. I looked at the bicycle one more time. The Schwinn Black Phantom, 1955. Rusted and forgotten and beautiful in its decay. Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. That thing about bearings and love and things falling apart. And I wondered if maybe he'd been trying to warn me about something all along. Trying to teach me to recognize when people had stopped caring, stopped maintaining, stopped greasing the bearings of family and love and basic human decency. My father and brother had been squeaking for years, and now they'd fallen apart completely. And somehow, I was left standing in the ruins, holding the key to a garage full of problems I couldn't even begin to calculate yet. The sun dropped below the horizon. The garage got darker, colder. I should have left, should have locked up and gone home. But I couldn't move, couldn't stop staring at that contract still sitting on the workbench, at my signature, already looking like something from the distant past, even though the ink was barely dry. I'd signed away something important. I just didn't know it yet, but I'd find out soon enough. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to actually go back to Grandpa's garage and start hauling stuff out. 3 days of staring at that oil-stained key on my kitchen counter and wondering what the hell I'd got myself into. 3 days of my girlfriend asking me why I looked like someone had kicked my dog. I didn't have a good answer for her. Didn't know how to explain that I'd voluntarily signed up to dismantle my grandfather's entire life, and somehow felt like I'd been conned into doing it. When I finally showed up with my pickup truck, the garage looked even worse than I remembered. Maybe it was the morning light. Maybe it was the fact that I was now legally responsible for every rusted bolt and mystery chemical in the place. Either way, it felt overwhelming, suffocating, almost like the walls were closing, and even though I was standing in a space big enough to fit 2 cars. I decided to start with a bicycle, the Schwinn Black Phantom. Everything else could wait, but that bike felt important, sacred, somehow, like if I could save that one thing, maybe the rest of this nightmare would be worth it. I cleared away the boxes and tarps and old newspapers that had accumulated around it over the years. Each layer revealed more rust, more decay, more evidence of time passing while nobody paid attention. The chrome was pitted. The leather seat was cracked and peeling. The tires were rotted through, just sad rubber husks that crumbled when I touched them. But underneath all that neglect, I could still see the bones of something beautiful. The classic lines, the sturdy frame, the kind of craftsmanship they don't bother with anymore because it's cheaper to make things disposable. I grabbed the frame with both hands, planning to lift it into the bed of my truck in one smooth motion. I've been working with cars and motorcycles for 15 years. I know how to lift heavy things, know how to use my legs, keep my back straight, all that safety training they drill into you. The bike didn't move. I adjusted my grip, tried again. The damn thing barely budged. It felt like it was bolted to the concrete floor. I stood there for a second, confused, stared at this bicycle that should have weighed maybe 35, 40 pounds maximum. The thing felt like it weighed as much as a motorcycle engine. Maybe more. I checked to make sure it wasn't actually attached to something. Nope. Free and clear. Just impossibly, inexplicably heavy. What the hell? This thing made of cast iron or something. I got a better angle. Used my legs properly this time. Managed to lift it enough to shuffle it toward the truck. My arms were shaking. My back was already complaining. This was ridiculous. I've pulled transmissions out of Chevys that weighed less than this bicycle. That's when the thought hit me. Bob, Grandpa's old friend who'd been dead for maybe 20 years now. He used to do this thing where he'd fill bike frames with lead shot for training. Made the bikes heavier, so when you rode a normal one, you'd be faster. Strong legs, he used to say. That's the secret. Train heavy, race light. Made sense. Weird sense, but sense. The tubes must be packed with lead. That would explain the weight. Would also explain why Grandpa never wanted to restore it. Too much work to drill it all out. Too much risk of lead contamination if you weren't careful. Better to just leave it buried under junk and forget about it. I finally got the bike into the truck bed, nearly threw out my back doing it. Stood there breathing hard, sweating despite the cool morning air, and wondered if this restoration project was going to be worth the herniated disc I was probably developing. That's when I heard the engine. Recognized it immediately. That particular purr of an expensive SUV with more horsepower than any reasonable person needs. Kyle's Range Rover. Black. Immaculate. The kind of vehicle that screams, I have more money than sense, and I need you to know it. He came down the driveway too fast. Always did. Even when we were kids, Kyle drove everything like he was trying to prove something. Like speed and aggression could make up for whatever was missing inside. I was standing next to my truck, and the bike was right there in the bed, still partially sticking out, because I hadn't had a chance to secure it yet. I saw what was about to happen a split second before it did. Saw Kyle's mirror lining up with the bike's front wheel. Saw him not slowing down, not adjusting his line, just barreling forward like the world was supposed to get out of his way. Metal hit metal. That distinctive crunch of something bending that's not supposed to bend. The whole bike shifted in the truck bed. The front wheel twisted at an angle that made me wince. Kyle didn't even stop, just slowed down enough to look back, grinned at me through his tinted window, and yelled something about adding it to my disposal bill. Laughed, actually laughed, then gunned it and disappeared down the street, leaving me standing there with my mouth open and my hands clenched into fists. I wanted to chase him, wanted to drag him out of that overpriced toy he drove and make him look at what he'd just done. But what would be the point? Kyle had been breaking things and walking away from them his entire life. This was just one more item on a very long list. I loaded the rest of my truck in silence, took all the hand tools I could fit, grabbed some boxes of parts that looked useful, left the mystery chemicals for later because I needed to research proper disposal methods, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with that particular headache yet. The whole time, I kept looking at the damaged bike and feeling this growing anger in my chest, not just at Kyle, at my father, at the whole situation, at myself for being dumb enough to sign that contract. By the time I got back to my shop, I was in a foul mood, the kind of mood where you want to hit something or break something or just scream into the void until your throat hurts. Instead, I did what I always do when I'm angry. I worked. My shop is nothing fancy. A 2-bay garage I rent on the edge of town. Far enough out that the landlord doesn't complain about noise, but close enough that I can still get deliveries. 1 bay for active projects, 1 bay for storage and my workbench. Concrete floors stained with oil and coolant, and every other automotive fluid known to man. Walls covered with tools I collected over the years, some inherited from Grandpa, some bought at pawn shops and estate sales, each one with its own history. I unloaded the bike onto my main workbench. The overhead lights were harsh, unforgiving. They showed every flaw, every rust spot, every place where time had won its slow battle against metal and chrome. The damage from Kyle's mirror was obvious. The down tube was bent, not severely, but enough that the bike would never ride straight without repair. The geometry was off. I could fix it, would have to fix it, but I'd need to cut out the damaged section and weld in a new piece. That meant exposing whatever was inside, probably dealing with lead shot, if my theory was right. Meant wearing a respirator and taking precautions because you don't mess around with lead contamination. I spent about an hour setting up, got my angle grinder ready, put on safety glasses, work gloves, a respirator, moved my ventilation fan into position, laid down plastic sheeting to catch any debris. I was doing this right. Professional. The way Grandpa would have done it. The grinder started with that high-pitched whine that every mechanic knows. The sound of progress. The sound of breaking things down so you can build them back better. I positioned the cutting disc against the tube right where the bend was worst. Applied pressure. Sparks flew in that beautiful cascade of orange and white that never gets old no matter how many times you see it. The disc bit into the metal. Old steel, good steel, the kind they don't make anymore because it costs too much and lasts too long. The cut was clean, smooth. I was maybe 2 inches into it when I felt the resistance change. The disc slowed, hit something that wasn't quite metal, wasn't quite solid, something viscous, greasy. I killed the grinder. The sudden silence was loud. I could hear my own breathing inside the respirator, rapid and shallow, because my heart had started pounding for reasons I didn't fully understand yet. Some instinct, some animal part of my brain recognizing that something was off. I grabbed my flashlight, the good one, the LED that puts out about 1,000 lumens and can light up a whole engine bay, shined it into the cut I'd made, saw black, not the black of an empty tube, the black of something inside, something that reflected the light with an oily sheen. I set down the grinder and picked up a screwdriver, started digging into the cut, widening it, trying to see what I was dealing with. The black stuff was thick, had the consistency of really old grease. Cosmoline, maybe, or that military-grade preservative they used to pack in gun barrels. Pulled out a chunk on the screwdriver, and it smelled like old shop smell, like machinery and time and things waiting in the dark. There was something solid in there, something embedded in the grease. I dug deeper with the screwdriver, felt it catch on something round, smooth, dense, worked it loose. A piece of metal about the size of a $50 fell onto the workbench with a sound that was heavier than it should have been, that distinctive clink of something valuable hitting steel. I picked it up. It was covered in the black grease, disguised, hidden. I grabbed a shop rag and started wiping it clean. The grease came off reluctantly, staining the cloth. Underneath was gold, not gold-colored, not brass or bronze or some cheap alloy. Gold. Actual gold. I could tell by the weight of it, by the way it caught the light, by something in my gut that knew what I was looking at even though my brain hadn't caught up yet. I wiped it cleaner. One side showed Lady Liberty striding forward, holding a torch, rays of sun behind her. Beautiful. The kind of design that makes you understand why people used to actually make money worth looking at. I flipped it over. An eagle in flight. And around the edge, text I had to squint to read. $20. United States of America. I looked closer at the date below Liberty's feet. 1927. Above it, barely visible, a tiny letter. D. My hand started shaking. Not a lot. Just enough that the coin trembled slightly. I knew what this was. A $20 gold piece. A double eagle. They stopped making these back in 1933, when the government recalled all the gold coins. St. Gaudens's design, named after the sculptor. Beautiful pieces, worth their weight in gold plus collector premium. Maybe $2,000 each at current market prices. But that little D was nagging at me. Mint mark. D meant Denver. Some mint marks made coins more valuable. I pulled out my phone with greasy fingers. Typed in St. Gaudens's 1927 D value. Hit search. The results loaded. I read the first line, then read it again because my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I dropped the phone. It clattered on the concrete floor. Screen cracked. Didn't care. The 1927 D. St. Gaudens Double Eagle. The rarest regular issue U.S. gold coin. Only 180,000 minted. Most melted down. Survivors in any condition worth 6 figures minimum. High-grade specimens selling for $2 to $3 million. Each. Per coin. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. Read it again. Checked 3 more sources. They all said the same thing. This wasn't just gold. This was a holy grail of U.S. numismatics sitting on my workbench, covered in cosmoline. 1 coin. 1 single coin. Why would 1 coin be packed in grease inside a bicycle frame? Unless there were more. I picked up the angle grinder again. My hands were steadier now. Purpose does that. Gives you calm when you need it. I made another cut, 6 inches away from the first one. Opened up a bigger section. More grease. More of that black preservative hiding something underneath. I started pulling it out with my hands. Didn't care about the mess anymore. Didn't care about anything except what might be in there. More coins. They started coming out one at a time. 2, 5, 10, each one packed carefully in grease. Each one pristine underneath the protective coating. Each one heavy with the weight of gold and questions and implications I couldn't even begin to process. I kept cutting. Open up the whole frame. Both tubes. The down tube. The top tube. The seat tube. Every hollow space in that bicycle had been packed. Carefully. Deliberately. Someone had taken this beautiful 1955 Schwinn Black Phantom and turned it into a bank vault on wheels. Someone had hidden a fortune in plain sight and then buried it under junk in a garage where nobody would look twice. The coins piled up on my workbench. I stopped counting after 50 because my brain couldn't handle math anymore. Couldn't handle multiplying the number of coins by $2,000 each. Couldn't handle the reality of what I was looking at. The frame kept giving them up, kept spilling its golden guts onto my work surface, like it had been waiting decades for someone to finally open it up and set it free. When I finally got the last coin out, I just stood there, stared at the pile of gold sitting on my workbench under the harsh LED lights. The grease had stained my hands black. My clothes were filthy. The frame of the bicycle was cut into sections, destroyed, its secret finally revealed, and I couldn't think, couldn't process. Could only stand there and try to breathe while my world shifted into something completely different. That's when I saw the paper. There was paper, tucked into the last section of the seat tube, wrapped in plastic, protected from the grease. I pulled it out carefully. My hands were shaking again. The plastic was brittle with age, but still intact. Inside was a piece of notebook paper, the kind with the holes punched on the side, the kind kids use in school. The handwriting was shaky. Old person handwriting, but still legible. It said, "Harry, if you're reading this, I'm dead and the Reds never came. Buy the kids something nice. Bob." That was it. 13 words. 13 words that explained everything and nothing. I read it 3 times. 4 times. Try to understand what it meant. Who Bob was writing to, when he'd written it. Why he'd hidden a fortune in a bicycle, and then what? Given it to Grandpa. Hidden it at Grandpa's house? The note raised more questions than it answered. But one thing was clear. Crystal clear. This gold had been meant for me. The kid. Buy the kid something nice. Bob had known. Had planned for this. Had packed his fortune into a bicycle and trusted Grandpa to keep it safe and somehow get it to me eventually. And Grandpa had kept that secret for decades. Had lived in that little house with its old appliances and secondhand furniture, had stretched every dollar, had done without so many things he could have easily afforded, all to honor the wishes of a dead friend, all to make sure I got what I was supposed to get. I started counting the coins. Needed to know, needed actual numbers to make this real. Laid them out on the workbench in rows, wiping each one clean enough to read the dates. 1924, 1926. 1928, 1922. The years jumped around. Most were from the 20s, back when these were still in circulation. Each one heavy. Each one real gold. Each one worth its melt value at minimum. Maybe $3,000 with collector premium for common dates. I sorted them by year as I cleaned them, made little piles, kept looking for that demint mark, the one that changed everything. Found one. My hands started shaking again. Found another. 21927. D coins sitting there on my workbench like they'd been waiting almost a century to be discovered. I kept sorting, kept wiping, kept checking every single coin with the flashlight held at an angle to catch that tiny letter above the date. Found the third, one near the bottom of the pile. 31927, D double eagles. I lined them up separate from the others, stared at them, picked up my phone again, the screen still cracked from when I dropped it, and searched for recent auction results. Needed to know what 3 of these actually meant. The search results made my vision blur. Heritage Auctions, 2019. 1927 de St. Gaudens MS 65 grade. Sold for $2.16 million. Stax Bowers, 2021. Same coin MS 64. $1.8 million. Another one lower grade, still 6 figures. The articles all said the same thing. Less than 20 known to exist in the world. Most in museum collections or locked away in private vaults. Any example that came to market caused a sensation in the numismatic community. I had 3 of them. 3. Sitting on my workbench in a dirty garage, covered in grease. Probably never professionally graded. Could be any condition from beat up to pristine. But even if they were scratched to hell, even if they were the worst examples anyone had ever seen, I was looking at $6 million minimum. If any of them graded well, if any hit that MS-64 or MS-65 sweet spot, I could be looking at $9 million. Maybe more. I did the full accounting on my phone's calculator because I needed to see it written down to believe it. 47 common date double eagles. Average value, maybe $2,500 each accounting for gold price and modest collector premium. That was about $120,000 right there. Not nothing, but not world-changing. Then the 3 1927 D coins, conservative estimate. Assuming they were in terrible shape, assuming the market had crashed, assuming everything went wrong. $2 million each, $6 million. Realistic estimate if they cleaned up decent. $7 to $9 million for all 3. Total pile sitting on my workbench. Best case, $9.1 million. Worst case, $6.1 million. Either way, I was looking at more money than I could process. More money than seemed real. The kind of money that existed in news articles about lottery winners and tech billionaires, not in the lives of guys who fix cars for a living. I sat down hard on my shop stool, the kind with wheels that squeaks when you move. It squeaked. The sound was absurdly normal, given that I was looking at enough money to never work again, to never worry about rent or bills, or whether I could afford new equipment. Enough money to fundamentally change what my life could be. Given that my grandfather had sat on the secret and said nothing, given that my father had basically tricked me into taking all of Grandpa's stuff without having any idea what was actually in it, that thought made me laugh. Couldn't help it. Started with a chuckle and built into something borderline hysterical. My father, the lawyer, the smart one, the one who always had an angle, always knew how to work the system. He'd been so clever with his contract, so satisfied with himself for pawning off the disposal costs, for getting me to haul away what he thought was junk, and he had no idea, no clue, had just handed me 3 of the rarest gold coins in existence because he was too greedy to pay for proper hazmat disposal. The irony was suffocating, beautiful, perfect. He'd been playing checkers while the universe was playing chess, had been so focused on saving a few $1,000s that he'd given away millions. And I'd almost missed it, too. If Kyle hadn't hit the bike with his mirror, if the frame hadn't been damaged, if I hadn't decided to cut it open and repair it, these coins would still be sitting in that garage packed in grease. Would have stayed hidden forever while I used Grandpa's tools, and eventually threw away the bike, because who restores a rusty old Schwinn when you're busy with paying work? The laughter turned into something else, something that involved tears. I was crying and laughing at the same time, sitting in my dirty shop surrounded by cut-up bicycle parts in grease and gold, holding a note from a dead man to another dead man about buying something nice for a kid who wasn't a kid anymore. The absurdity of it, the tragedy of it, the sheer cosmic joke of my grandfather living poor while sitting on a fortune because he'd made a promise to a friend, because honor mattered more than comfort, because some things were more important than money. I thought about all those times Grandpa had told me he couldn't afford to help with college, couldn't afford to lend me money for my first car, couldn't afford to fix his own roof when it leaked. And all that time he had enough money to solve every problem 10 times over, to make life easy, to never worry about anything material again. And he'd chosen not to, had chosen to keep Bob's secret, to wait to trust that someday I'd find it and understand. Did I understand? I wasn't sure. Part of me wanted to be angry at him, wanted to shake him and ask why he'd suffered when he didn't have to. But another part of me, a deeper part, got it. Got that some promises matter more than comfort. Some friendships outlive death. Some secrets are worth keeping even when they hurt. Bob's note said the Reds never came. I didn't know what that meant. Some Cold War paranoia? Some inside joke? Some real threat that never materialized? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Bob had trusted Grandpa, and Grandpa had kept that trust for 20 years, maybe more, had packed away his own comfort and ease for the sake of a dead friend's wishes, and then had died without ever telling anyone, assuming, I guess, that someday someone would find it, that someday I would find it. I picked up one of the 1927 D coins again, held it up to the light. It gleamed, perfect, untouched by time or inflation, or any of the things that usually eat away at value. The tiny D above the date seemed to glow, one of maybe 15 or 20 examples left in the world. Museum-quality rarity sitting in my hand like a poker chip, like it was nothing, like it wasn't worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The shop was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner where I kept cold drinks. That, and my own breathing, which was finally starting to steady. The initial shock was wearing off. Reality was setting in. I had a pile of gold on my workbench. 3 coins that numismatists would literally kill for. 50 coins total that represented more money than I could reasonably spend in 10 lifetimes. And I had a decision to make about what came next. But sitting there in that moment, surrounded by the physical evidence of my grandfather's character, all I could think about was how much I missed him, how much I wished I could call him up and ask him about Bob, about the bicycle, about why he never said anything, about whether he'd known I'd eventually sign that stupid contract and end up here in my shop, covered in grease and tears and holding a fortune I never asked for. The note sat on the workbench next to the coins. By the kid, something nice. I picked it up again, studied the handwriting, imagined Bob writing it. Decades ago, paranoid about Russians, or maybe just paranoid in general, packing his savings into the most unlikely place he could think of, a bicycle, a kid's bicycle, the last place anyone would look for gold. And then what? Asking Grandpa to hide it? Storing it at Grandpa's house? The details were loss of time and death, and secrets that died with the men who kept them. I sat there until the sun started setting, until the light coming through the shop windows turned golden, ironic given what was sitting on my workbench, until my back hurt from sitting on that damn stool, and my eyes were dry from crying, and I couldn't feel shocked anymore, because the human brain can only maintain that level of intensity for so long before it shuts down into something calmer, something more manageable, something like acceptance. $6 to $9 million. The range didn't even matter at that point. Both numbers were equally incomprehensible, equally life-changing, equally terrifying in their implications. Enough to change everything. Pay off my debts. Buy better equipment. Hell, buy this whole building. Buy 10 buildings. Never work again if I didn't want to. The possibilities were staggering, overwhelming, terrifying in their scope, but mixed in with all that potential was something else. Something uncomfortable. The knowledge that my father was going to lose his mind when he found out, and he would find out. There was no keeping the secret. I'd have to report it, have to figure out the legal implications, have to deal with taxes and documentation, and all the bureaucratic nightmare that comes with suddenly having assets you can't explain with a simple story. The note seemed to glow in the fading light. Bob's last words. Harry, if you're reading this, I'm dead and the Reds never came. Buy the kid something nice. Simple, direct, a life savings reduced to a single sentence and a pile of gold coins packed in grease. No explanation, no context, just trust that Grandpa would do the right thing. And he had. He'd kept it safe, kept it secret, kept it from me even though he never told me about it, even though he died without saying a word. That was the part that hurt most. Not the years of struggle, not the missed opportunities, but the fact that Grandpa had carried this alone, had never shared the burden, had never asked for help or recognition or even acknowledgement that what he was doing was hard. He'd just done it, quietly, without complaint, the way he did everything else in his life, with dignity and honor and a kind of stubborn integrity that felt almost alien in a world where everyone was always looking for an angle. I thought about my father again, about his satisfied smile when I signed that contract, about how clever he thought he was, how he'd managed to offload his problem onto me and save himself thousands in disposal costs. And I laughed again. Couldn't help it. The universe had a sense of humor, after all. Poetic justice in the form of 3 impossibly rare gold coins in Greece, and a bicycle that weighed way more than it should. The shop was almost dark now. I should have turned on more lights. Should have cleaned up the mess. Should have done something productive instead of just sitting there holding a note from a dead man and trying to process a reality that had shifted so dramatically that I wasn't sure which way was up anymore. But I couldn't move. Could only sit there and feel the weight of everything. The gold, the responsibility, the knowledge that nothing was going to be simple anymore, that this discovery had changed everything in ways I couldn't even begin to understand yet. Tomorrow I'd have to figure out what to do, who to call, how to handle this legally, how to protect myself from whatever was coming, because something was definitely coming. You don't suddenly acquire 3 museum-quality rare coins and $6 million in gold without consequences, without attention, without complications that multiply faster than you can count them. But tonight, in this moment, I just sat with it. Sat with the gold and the note and the memory of my grandfather's hands teaching me how to use a wrench. Sat with the knowledge that honor was real, that some men still kept promises even when it cost them everything, that legacy wasn't about money or possessions but about character and integrity and the things you passed down that couldn't be measured in dollars. The kid, that's what Bob had called me in his note. The kid. I was 43 years old. Had gray in my beard and pain in my knees and a failed marriage behind me. But to Bob, writing that note decades ago, I was still the kid, still worth protecting, still worth buying something nice for. And Grandpa had honored that, had kept his friend's wish sacred long after that friend was dust. I finally stood up. My legs were stiff. My back complained. The pile of gold coins sat there on my workbench, the 31927. D pieces separated from the others like royalty among commoners. I covered them all with a clean shop towel, locked the shop door, set the security system. Tomorrow I'd figure out what came next. Tonight, I just needed to go home and try to sleep and hope that when I woke up, this would all still be real and not some grief-induced hallucination brought on by stress and loss and signing contracts I should have read more carefully. The last thing I saw before I turned off the lights was that note, Bob's handwriting. By the kid something nice. I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet, right there with my license and the picture of Grandpa from when he was young and strong, and the world still made sense. Some things you keep close. Some messages matter more than money. Some promises outlive the men who made them and become the only things worth preserving in the end. I made the mistake of trying to do things right. That's what killed me. Or almost killed me. Anyway, see, when you suddenly find yourself sitting on $6 to $9 million in rare gold coins, you can't just walk into a pawn shop and cash out. You need experts, authenticators, grading services, insurance, legal documentation. You need to prove provenance, establish chain of custody, make sure everything's above board, so the IRS doesn't show up asking uncomfortable questions about unreported income. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I contacted a numismatic authentication service, made an appointment, brought in the 31927 D coins for evaluation. The guy behind the counter nearly had a heart attack when he saw them. Started making phone calls. Within an hour, I had 3 different coin dealers offering to broker a private sale. Within 2 hours, word had spread to the collector community like wildfire. Within 3 days, my father knew. I didn't get a phone call, didn't get a visit, didn't even get a strongly worded letter. What I got was a notification from my bank that my accounts had been frozen pending a court order, a restraining order, filed by Robert Sullivan, executor of the estate of Harry Sullivan, claiming that property belonging to the estate had been misappropriated and needed to be secured pending litigation. My father didn't waste time, didn't give me a chance to prepare. Just went straight for the throat with the kind of surgical precision that made him successful in his legal career. Hit me where it hurt before I even knew I was in a fight. I called him, left 3 voicemails. He didn't respond. Instead, I got served papers at my shop by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole thing. The complaint was 12 pages long and used the kind of language that makes you feel guilty even when you've done nothing wrong. Fraud, misrepresentation, undue influence, constructive trust. Every legal term my father could throw at the wall to see what would stick. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks out. I needed a lawyer. Couldn't afford a good one, not with my accounts frozen. All that money sitting in my shop, and I was suddenly broke. Couldn't touch my savings. Couldn't access my business accounts. Could barely buy groceries with the cash I had in my wallet. The irony was suffocating. I called every attorney I could find. None of them wanted to touch it. Too messy. Too much money at stake. Too high a probability of getting tied up in litigation for years. Plus, I was going up against Robert Sullivan, who had a reputation in local legal circles. Taking him on was career suicide for a small-time lawyer. I was about to give up when I got a call from a guy named Frank Castellano. Said he'd heard about my situation through the grapevine. Said he used to play poker with my grandpa back in the day. Asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. Frank looked like he'd walked out of a 1970s detective show. Rumpled suit, loose tie, hair that probably hadn't seen a comb in a week. He drove a beat-up Honda Civic with a crack in the windshield and talked like he had all the time in the world. Nothing like the sharp-dressed lawyers I've been trying to hire. Nothing like my father at all. He listened to my story while drinking terrible diner coffee and taking notes on a yellow legal pad with a pen that was running out of ink. Didn't interrupt. Didn't ask many questions. Just nodded occasionally and wrote things down in handwriting that looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. When I finished, he sat back and smiled. Told me he'd take the case. Told me not to worry about payment up front. Told me that Harry Sullivan had been a good friend and this was the least he could do. I wanted to ask him if he understood what he was getting into, going up against a lawyer like my father. But something about the way Frank smiled made me think maybe he knew exactly what he was getting into. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Not like the grand judicial chambers you see on TV. Just a regular county courtroom with fluorescent lights and acoustic ceiling tiles and chairs that squeaked when you moved. Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding. A woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and an expression that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of human stupidity and wasn't impressed by any of it. My father arrived with 2 associates, junior lawyers carrying briefcases and looking eager to impress. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. Polished shoes. Perfect hair. The kind of presentation that screamed competence and authority. He didn't look at me. Didn't acknowledge my presence. Just sat down at his table and started arranging papers like this was just another day at the office. Frank showed up 5 minutes before the hearing started, carrying a backpack instead of a briefcase, wearing the same rumpled suit I'd seen at the coffee shop. The bailiff looked at him like he might be lost. The judge looked at him like she was already regretting whatever was about to happen. My father looked at him like he'd just spotted a particularly stupid fly that needed swatting. Judge Hendricks called the hearing to order, asked my father to present his case. And that's when I watched a master at work. My father stood up and became someone else. Not the cold, calculating man from the garage. Not the guy who tricked me into signing away my problems. He became reasonable, sympathetic, concerned. The kind of lawyer who wasn't trying to win, just try to make sure justice was served. He explained the situation to the judge like he was telling a story to a friend, about his father's death, about the garage full of old belongings, about trying to settle the estate and finding himself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stuff that needed disposing of, about offering his son a chance to keep anything meaningful while also helping clear out the space, about wanting to be generous and family-minded in a difficult time. His voice never rose, never got aggressive, Just stayed calm and reasonable and logical. He painted himself as a son trying to honor his father's memory, while also being practical about the realities of estate management. Painted me as someone who'd taken advantage of a generous offer to exploit a legal loophole for personal gain. Then he got to the meat of it, the doctrine of mutual mistake of fact. He explained it to the judge using an analogy. Said imagine if he'd sold me a cow for meat prices, and then we discovered it was actually a prize-breeding cow worth $1 million. Said the law recognized that when both parties to a contract are fundamentally mistaken about the nature of what's being exchanged, that contract can be voided. So we both thought we were dealing with worthless junk. Neither of us knew about the gold coins. Therefore, the contract was based on a shared false assumption about the subject matter. The judge was nodding. Actually nodding. She was buying it. My father kept going. Talked about how if he'd known about the coins, he never would have agreed to let me take them. Talked about how the entire premise of our agreement was disposing of worthless items, not transferring millions of dollars in hidden assets. Talked about how the law couldn't possibly intend to let someone profit from what was essentially a mistake of fact about the core substance of a transaction. He used another analogy. Asked the judge to imagine selling someone a painting you thought was a reproduction for $100, only to discover it was an original Rembrandt worth $50 million. Asked whether it would be fair for the buyer to keep it simply because you'd both been mistaken about what you were selling. Said the whole point of the mutual mistake doctrine was to prevent exactly this kind of unjust enrichment. It was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. He wasn't arguing that I'd done anything wrong. Exactly. Just that we both made an honest mistake, and the law provided a remedy for that mistake. He made it sound like he was trying to be fair, trying to do the right thing, trying to make sure the estate got what it was legally entitled to. The judge asked him what he was requesting. He said simply that the court should void the transfer and return the coins to the estate for proper distribution, according to his father's will. Said he wasn't even asking for damages or trying to punish anyone. Just wanted to correct an obvious mistake before it became a permanent injustice. He sat down. The courtroom was quiet. I felt like I'd just watched someone build an airtight case for taking away everything I'd found. Felt like the walls were closing in. Felt like that bicycle frame, crushed and cut open, all its secrets exposed. Frank stood up, slowly, like his knees hurt, like standing was an effort. He shuffled some papers on his table, dropped his pen, picked it up. The judge looked impatient. My father looked satisfied. I looked at the exit and wondered if I could just leave, just walk away and pretend this was happening to someone else. Frank cleared his throat, asked the judge if he could pose a few questions to the opposing counsel. The judge looked annoyed but allowed it. Frank turned to my father with this expression that I couldn't quite read. Not aggressive, not defensive, just curious, like he was genuinely confused about something and needed clarification. He asked my father to confirm that he'd personally drafted the contract. My father said yes. Frank asked him to confirm that he was an experienced attorney who understood contract law. My father said yes, with a slight edge to his voice, like the question was insulting. Frank nodded, said he appreciated the clarification. Then Frank asked if my father could read a specific section of the contract. Section 4.2. My father's jaw tightened slightly. First crack in the facade, but he was too confident to refuse. He picked up his copy of the contract and read it aloud. The recipient accepts full material responsibility for any and all environmental risks and disposal costs associated with any contents of the subject property, known or unknown, including but not limited to hazardous materials, toxic substances, flammable compounds, corrosive agents, and any other materials requiring special handling or disposal under local, state, or federal environmental regulations. Frank thanked him, then asked another question. Asked if my father had been concerned about potential hazardous materials in the garage. My father said, of course, that was obvious from the condition of the space. Frank asked if that concern had influenced how the contract was written. My father said naturally, he'd wanted to make sure the disposal liability was clearly assigned. Frank nodded again, that same curious expression. Then he turned to the judge. What he said next changed everything. He told the judge this wasn't a case of mutual mistake of fact. Said both parties hadn't been mistaken about the nature of the transaction. Said my father had known exactly what he was doing when he drafted that contract. Said Section 4.2 wasn't just liability protection. It was a risk allocation clause. A conscious decision about how to handle uncertainty. Frank explained it simply. Said my father had been worried about what might be in those tubes. Could have been lead. Could have been asbestos. Could have been toxic chemicals that would cost tens of thousands to dispose of properly. Could have been an environmental nightmare that would result in EPA fines and cleanup costs that would drain the estate. So instead of dealing with it himself, he created what contract law calls a blind bid situation. He told the judge to think of it like a mystery box auction. Said when you bid on a storage unit without knowing what's inside, you're making a conscious choice to accept the risk that it might be worthless or that it might be valuable. Said you can, on the auction, discover treasure and then demand a refund because you didn't know treasure was inside. Said the whole point of a blind bid is that both parties are accepting uncertainty as part of the deal. Frank kept going, his voice getting stronger, more confident. Said my father had drafted that contract to specifically cover unknown contents. Said the phrase known or unknown wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. It was my father explicitly stating that whatever was in that property, whether anyone knew about it or not, was being transferred to me along with all associated risks and benefits. He used an analogy that made the judge sit up straighter. Said you can't buy a lottery ticket, discover it's a winner, and then demand your dollar back from the convenience store because you both thought it was going to be worthless. Said the whole nature of a lottery ticket is uncertainty. You pay money. You accept risk. Sometimes you lose. Sometimes you win. But you can't undo the transaction just because the outcome wasn't what you expected. Then Frank hit the knockout punch. Said the doctrine of mutual mistake doesn't apply when the parties have consciously allocated the risk of that mistake in their contract. Said when someone drafts a contract that specifically covers unknown contents and transfers all rights and responsibilities for those contents regardless of what they turn out to be, that person is making a conscious choice to accept the uncertainty. They're saying, I don't know what's in there, but whatever it is, it's your problem now. And that means they can't later claim they were mistaken about what they were transferring. The judge was leaning forward now, actually interested. Frank pulled out a stack of cases. Precedents, contract law going back decades, cases where courts had ruled that risk allocation clauses override mutual mistake claims, cases where people had tried to undo deals after unexpected outcomes and been told no, you made your bed, now lie in it. He read excerpts. One case about a property sale where the land turned out to have mineral rights worth millions. The seller tried to void the sale, claiming mutual mistake. Court said no. The contract had allocated all subsurface rights to the buyer. The seller had accepted uncertainty about what those rights might be worth. Too bad. Another case about someone selling what they thought was costume jewelry that turned out to be real diamonds. Same result. The sales contract had been clear. All items as is. Risk accepted. Frank then addressed my father directly. Asked him if he'd been trying to avoid environmental liability. When he wrote that contract, my father started to object, but the judge told him to answer. He admitted yes, that had been a consideration. Frank asked if he'd specifically chosen to transfer that risk to me rather than investigate the contents himself. My father's face was getting red. He admitted yes. Frank smiled, that same rumpled, friendly smile from the coffee shop, told the judge that my father was a sophisticated attorney who'd made a calculated business decision. He'd been afraid of hazmat, disposal costs, afraid of EPA fines, afraid of environmental liability. So he'd written a contract that protected him from all that by transferring every possible risk to me, his son, in exchange for not having to deal with it himself. And now that those unknown contents had turned out to be valuable instead of toxic, he wanted a do-over. Frank said the law doesn't work that way. Said you can't have it both ways. Said my father had specifically drafted language to cover exactly the situation, and now he had to live with the consequences of his own careful planning. Said if the tubes had been full of lead contamination, my father would have been perfectly happy to let me eat those disposal costs. But because they were full of gold instead, he wanted to claim a stake and claw back the asset. The judge looked at my father. Asked him directly if he'd chosen to transfer unknown contents without investigation specifically to avoid potential liability. My father tried to dance around it, tried to say it wasn't quite that simple. But the judge wasn't having it. She asked again, yes or no? My father said yes. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. You could hear the air conditioning humming. You could hear someone's stomach growl 3 rows back. You could hear my father's associate shifting uncomfortably in his seat, and the papers rustling as he pretended to look through files. Judge Hendricks took off her glasses, cleaned them with a cloth from her robe pocket, put them back on, looked at my father with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she spoke. She said the doctrine of mutual mistake of fact requires that both parties to a contract were mistaken about a basic assumption that materially affects the agreement. Said in this case, there was no mutual mistake because the contract explicitly allocated the risk of uncertainty about contents. Said Section 4.2 made clear that my father had consciously chosen to transfer all rights and responsibilities for unknown materials rather than investigate them himself. Said that was a risk allocation decision, not a mistake. She said when someone drafts a contract that specifically contemplates unknown contents and transfers them as is, they cannot later claim they were mistaken about what those contents turn out to be. Said the whole point of an as-is transfer is that you're accepting the good with the bad. Said you can't cherry-pick after the fact. She cited one of Frank's cases, the one about the mineral rights. Said it was directly on point. Said the plaintiff in this case was an experienced attorney who drafted sophisticated contract language to protect himself from downside risk. Said he couldn't now complain about upside risk playing out in the other party's favor. Said contract law rewards people who bear risk and penalizes people who try to transfer risk and then demand a share of unexpected benefits. The judge ruled the contract was valid and enforceable. Said the transfer of the garage contents, including the bicycle and its contents, was final and binding. Said the restraining order on my accounts would be lifted immediately. Said the coins were legally mine. Dismissed the case with prejudice, which meant my father couldn't try again. My father's face went through about 5 stages of grief in 10 seconds. Shock, denial, anger, more anger. Then this pale, defeated look like someone had just told him his favorite restaurant had closed forever. He gathered his papers in silence. His associates looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. They filed out without looking at me. Frank packed up his backpack slowly, gave me that rumpled smile, told me Harry would have enjoyed watching that, told me to take care of myself, told me if I ever needed anything, I knew where to find him. Then he shuffled out of the courtroom, looking exactly like someone who hadn't just demolished a top-tier attorney in open court. I sat there for a while after everyone left. Just sat in that squeaky chair in that fluorescent-lit courtroom and tried to process what had just happened. I'd won. Actually won. The coins were mine. The money was mine. My father had tried to take it all back and failed. The universe had actually delivered something resembling justice. But sitting there, I didn't feel triumphant. Didn't feel like celebrating. Just felt tired. Tired and sad and weirdly hollow. Because winning meant my father had tried to screw me over. Meant he'd been willing to weaponize the legal system to take back something he'd given me. Meant whatever relationship we'd had, whatever fragile connection still existed, was probably gone forever. And for what? For money. For gold coins packed in grease that neither of us had known existed a month ago. I thought about Grandpa, about what he would have said if he'd been there. Probably something about bearings and grease, and things falling apart when you don't maintain them. Probably something philosophical about the price of integrity versus the cost of compromise. Probably something that made sense only in hindsight. I didn't become a millionaire playboy. Didn't buy a mansion or a sports car, or take a year off to travel the world. The money from the coins, after taxes and Frank's fee and various other expenses, was substantial, enough to change my life. But I wasn't interested in changing my life in obvious ways. I bought the lot next to my shop, expanded the garage, got better equipment, hired an assistant who knew more about electrical systems than I did, started taking on restoration projects I'd always wanted to do but never had the resources for. Classic cars, vintage motorcycles, The kind of work that made me feel connected to something larger than myself. The kind of work Grandpa would have approved of, and I restored the Black Phantom. Took me 6 months. I had to fabricate new tubes for the frame, since I'd cut the originals open, had to source period correct parts, had to strip and repaint and rechrome everything. But when I was done, it was beautiful, better than new. A 1955 Schwinn Black Phantom that looked like it had just rolled off the factory floor. I kept one of the Common Date Double Eagles, not one of the 1927 D pieces, just a regular 1924. Had it cleaned and graded. Then I had a jeweler mount on the frame where the head badge used to be. Made it part of the bike. A reminder, a memorial, a way of keeping Bob and Grandpa and the whole ridiculous story connected to something physical and real. Sometimes I ride that bike. Not often. It's too valuable to risk damaging. But on quiet Sunday mornings when the shop is closed and the streets are empty, I'll take it out and pedal through the neighborhood. It rides smooth, quiet, solid, the way things used to be made when people care about quality over quarterly profits. And when I'm riding it, I think about the two men who shaped this story. My father, who tried to give me garbage to save himself money and ended up giving me a fortune, and my grandfather, who kept a friend's secret for decades, lived poor while sitting on wealth, and trusted that eventually someone would find it and understand. I know which one was truly rich. My father and I don't talk anymore. He tried to reach out once, about 6 months after the court case. Left a voicemail about family and forgiveness and moving forward. But some things, once broken, can't be fixed with words. Some relationships, once you see them clearly, can't be unseen. The bearings have been squeaking for years. Now they'd finally fallen apart completely. Kyle sent me a Facebook friend request that I ignored. Heard through the grapevine that he was telling people I'd gotten lucky. That anybody could have found those coins. That it wasn't a big deal. I didn't bother correcting him. Some people need to believe the world is random, and success is just luck. Makes them feel better about their own choices. The shop is doing well. Better than well. I've got more work than I can handle. A waiting list of clients who want restorations done right instead of done fast. I've been training my assistant, teaching him the things Grandpa taught me, about patience, about craftsmanship, about how the quality of your work reflects the quality of your character. There's a picture on my office wall, black and white photo of Grandpa in his younger days, standing in front of the same garage that started this whole mess. He's smiling, not a big smile, just this small, satisfied expression like he knows something you don't, like he's in on a joke the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. Sometimes I look at that picture and wonder if he knew, if he had any idea what was in that bike frame. If he kept it all those years waiting for exactly this moment, or if it was all just coincidence, just a series of random events that happened to line up in a way that looked like planning. I don't know, probably never will, but I've decided it doesn't matter. The coins are authenticated now, graded. 2 of the 1927 D pieces came back MS 64. 1 came back MS 65. I sold them at auction through Heritage. The MS 65 went for just over $2 million, the others for slightly less. After taxes and fees, I cleared about $4.5 million. The Common Date coins I sold privately. Another $90,000 or so. More money than I need. More money than I know what to do with. But it's not about the money anymore. Never really was. I guess it was about honor, about promises, about whether a man's word means anything, or if everything's just negotiable depending on the circumstances. My father chose to protect his wallet, chose to manipulate and scheme and play legal games. And in the end, his cleverness cost him millions. My grandfather chose to keep a promise to a dead friend, chose to live poor rather than break trust, chose character over comfort. And in the end, his integrity created a legacy that means more than money ever could. I keep Bob's note in a frame on my desk, right next to the picture of Grandpa. The paper's yellowed now, the ink's fading, but the words are still clear. Harry, if you're reading this, I'm dead and the Reds never came. Buy the kid something nice. Bob never knew who I was. Never met me. Probably didn't even know I existed when he wrote that note. But he trusted Grandpa to do the right thing, to keep a promise, to make sure that if his paranoid Cold War fears never materialized, at least someone would benefit from his life savings. And Grandpa did exactly that. Kept that bicycle safe for decades. Kept the secret. Kept the faith. Even when it cost him. Even when he could have used that money himself. Even when nobody would have known if he'd cracked open those tubes and solved his own financial problems. That's the real treasure, I think. Not the gold coins. Not the money. But the knowledge that honor still exists. That some men still keep promises, even when it hurts. That integrity isn't just a word people use in mission statements. It's a choice. A daily choice to do what's right, even when what's easy is staring you in the face. My father wanted to leave me trash to save his wallet. My grandfather left me trash to save my soul. I know which one was truly wealthy. The black phantom hangs on the wall of my shop now. Pride of place. The gold coin catches a light sometimes, throwing little reflections around the room like tiny promises kept. People ask about it. Ask why I put a valuable coin on a bicycle where it could get damaged. Ask why I don't keep it locked up somewhere safe. I tell them it belongs there. Tell them it's where it's supposed to be. Tell them some things are more valuable when they're used to their intended purpose rather than locked in a vault gathering dust. Most of them don't understand. That's okay. Some lessons only make sense after you've learned them the hard way. Some truths only reveal themselves when you're sitting in a dirty garage covered in grease, holding a note from a dead man, and trying to figure out what honor looks like in a world that seems to have forgotten the word. I figured out, I think. Took me 43 years and a rusted bicycle and a father who tried to steal from me and a grandfather who died poor to teach me. But I got there eventually. Honor looks like keeping a promise nobody would know you broke. Looks like choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. Looks like understanding that wealth isn't what you have. It's who you are. Looks like an old man in a garage, sitting on a fortune he'll never spend, because some things matter more than money. I ride the Black Phantom on Sunday mornings. Feel the weight of it. Feel the gold coin mount on the frame. Feel the ghost of my grandfather's approval and Bob's paranoid trust, and the weight of promises kept across decades. And I understand, finally, what Grandpa was trying to teach me all those years. About bearings. About grease. About maintenance and care and the slow deterioration that happens when you stop paying attention to what matters. Some people are like bearings. If you don't grease them with love, they squeak, and then they fall apart. My father fell apart. Kyle fell apart. Their bearings dried out years ago, and nobody noticed until it was too late to fix. But Grandpa kept his bearings greased, kept his promises maintained, kept the parts that mattered working smooth, even when everything else was falling to pieces around him. That's the inheritance, not the gold. The example, the knowledge that one man, at least, live his principles instead of just talking about them. I'm trying to do the same. Trying to keep my bearings greased. Trying to honor the legacy of promises kept and integrity maintained. Trying to be the kind of man Bob trusted sight unseen. The kind of man Grandpa was without even trying. Some days I succeed. Some days I fail. But I keep trying. Keep working. Keep restoring old things and teaching my assistant and riding that ridiculous heavy bicycle through empty streets on Sunday mornings. Keep remembering that true wealth isn't counted in dollars. It's counted in promises kept and honor maintained, and the legacy you leave for people you'll never meet. My father will never understand that. He's too busy counting what he lost to see what he threw away. But I understand it now. Finally. Completely. And that understanding is worth more than all the gold in all the bicycle frames in all the garages in the world.